Life's unpredictability can lead to the most ironic endings. In this video, we'll uncover 5 real stories of people who met their fate in shockingly ironic ways. These unforgettable tales serve as a chilling reminder that both life and death can take unexpected, strange, and often surprising turns, sometimes in ways so twisted they almost seem scripted. It was September 4th, 2006, in Queensland, Australia. Steve Irwin, the famed wildlife expert known as the crocodile hunter, was filming a documentary titled Ocean's Deadliest at Bat Reef, part of the Great Barrier Reef. At 44 years old, Irwin was at the peak of his career. He was adored worldwide for his daring encounters with dangerous animals. Steve had married Terry Irwin, and together they had 2 children, Bindi and Robert. His passion for wildlife began early. At just 6 years old, he caught a venomous brown snake, and by 9, he was already wrestling crocodiles. These early experiences shaped his future, eventually leading him to manage Birwa Reptile and Fauna Park, which his parents had started in 1970. Under Steve's leadership, the park was renamed Australia Zoo, and his larger-than-life personality catapulted him to global fame, most notably through his hit TV series, The Crocodile Hunter. By July 2006, Steve was riding high. He and Terry had just plotted out a 10-year plan for the zoo, and he was passionate about spreading his conservation message to the world. He often said, "If we don't get animals into people's hearts, they will go extinct. We're running out of time." But just a few months later, his dedication to wildlife would lead to a tragic and ironic end. On that fateful day in September, bad weather had delayed their original plan to film tiger sharks. Restless and eager to make use of the day, Irwin and his crew, including his close friend and longtime cameraman Justin Lyons, set out in an inflatable boat to film alternative footage. Soon, they spotted an 8-foot-wide stingray, perfect for another project they were working on. Stingrays are generally peaceful creatures. If disturbed, they usually swim away. But this one acted differently. As Irwin and Lyons prepared for one final shot, the stingray suddenly attacked. It propped itself up and began striking with its tail, wildly and rapidly. Lyons recalled the horrifying moment. All of a sudden, it propped on its front and started stabbing wildly with its tail, hundreds of strikes in a few seconds. One of the strikes hit Steve in the chest with a force Lyons likened to a hot knife through butter. Steve stood up in a pool of blood. Lyons immediately knew something was terribly wrong. They pulled him into the boat and raced back to their main vessel, Croc 1. Steve was conscious but in extreme pain. He told Lyons, "It punctured my lung." But the reality was even worse. The stingray's barb had pierced his heart. Desperate to keep him alive, Lyons and the crew performed CPR for over an hour, urging him to think of his children. Steve looked at Justin Lyons and said his final words, "I'm dying." Despite their efforts, by the time they reached medical help, it was too late. The stingray's strike had caused catastrophic damage to his heart, making survival impossible. The news of Steve Irwin's death stunned the world. A man known for fearlessly handling crocodiles, snakes, and some of the deadliest animals on the planet was brought down by a stingray, an animal often referred to as the pussycat of the ocean. Toxicologist Jamie Seymour, who was also aboard Croc 1 that day, later explained, "It was just a really bad accident. Under some circumstances, it just goes wrong." Steve Irwin's death left a deep void in the world of wildlife conservation. Steve's legacy lives on, through his family, through Australia Zoo, and through the millions of people around the world he inspired to care about wildlife.
The man was pulled from the pool, and several lifeguards performed CPR until the paramedics and police arrived, but he was pronounced dead on the scene. 31-year-old Jerome Moody was just a guest at the party.
It was August 1985 in New Orleans, Louisiana. The New Orleans Recreation Department threw a party at a city pool, inviting over 200 people. Nearly half of them were certified lifeguards, watchful eyes trained to prevent tragedy. 4 remained on duty that evening just in case. Laughter echoed through the humid night air as lifeguards shared stories of close calls and proud saves. Among the guests was 31-year-old Jerome Moody. He wasn't a lifeguard. He was just there to enjoy the evening, standing quietly along the poolside, dressed in regular clothes, taking in the celebration from the sidelines. To most, he blended into the crowd. But as the evening wore on, the celebration took a chilling turn. As the pool began to clear and lifeguards prepared to wrap up the night, someone glanced into the deep end and froze. There, at the bottom of the pool, completely unnoticed until that moment, was Jerome, motionless, fully clothed, unmoving. Panic surged through the crowd. CPR was performed. Emergency crews were called, but it was too late. Jerome Moody had drowned, right in the middle of a party thrown to celebrate the fact that no one had. The irony hit like a wave. A man had lost his life surrounded by dozens of trained professionals in a place designed for safety on a night meant to mark success. The disbelief was immediate and gut-wrenching. An autopsy confirmed what the scene already suggested. Jerome had drowned. He hadn't been swimming with the others. He wasn't in a swimsuit, and no one saw him slip into the water. Whether it was an accident, a misstep, or something more remains unclear. In the blur of laughter and celebration, he had vanished without a sound. Madeline Richard, the director of the New Orleans Recreation Department, struggled to process the devastation, but Jerome Moody was more than a tragic headline. He was a dreamer, an entrepreneur, and a man who had built a life rooted in ambition and service. Born in Emporia, Virginia, Jerome moved to Portsmouth where he pursued education and dreamed of running his own business. He worked hard as a delivery driver and eventually fulfilled his goal, owning and operating Dee's Dry Cleaners in the Bronx for several years. Later, he returned to Virginia, earned a degree from Norfolk State University, and became a devoted community activist. He was deeply involved with Noble Street Baptist Church and the Wilson Ward Civic League. He was a father, a grandfather, a brother, and then, in a matter of moments, he was gone. It was midnight on January 4th, 2005 on Interstate 80 near Lincoln, Nebraska. Derek Kyer, just 21 years old, was heading back to the University of Nebraska-Lincoln after spending the holidays in San Antonio. The semester was about to start. He had big plans. He was in the back seat of a Ford Explorer. His friend Luke Homan was driving, and another friend, Nick Uphoff, sat in the front passenger seat. All three were fraternity brothers, more like brothers in life. Derek wasn't just another college student. He was chasing 5 majors. And he wasn't just scraping by. He had a perfect 4.0 GPA. He had studied at Oxford. He wanted law school next. Everyone could see it. Derek was going places. But on that icy stretch of road, fate had a cruel twist waiting. A trucker driving nearby spotted the Ford Explorer lose control. One moment it was steady. The next, it skidded, spun, and then rolled violently, flipping over and over before crashing into a frozen ditch. The call to 911 came fast, and first responders arrived quickly. But when they did, the scene was already marked by silence. Derek had been thrown from the vehicle. He wasn't wearing a seatbelt. His body was found outside, still and cold, lying in the snow. There was no bringing him back. Inside the wreck, Luke and Nick survived, bruised, battered, but alive. They'd been wearing seatbelts. The news shattered everything. Derek's father, Paul Kyer, was numb with disbelief. He had moved to Lincoln just to be closer to his son, to be there for the journey, the milestones. Now he was facing the unimaginable. "I'm in shock," he said quietly in an interview, barely able to find the words. Friends were crushed. Cade Pittman, who had known Derek since 7th grade, struggled to hold back the heartbreak. "He'd do anything for anybody," Cade said. "He tutored me in classes he didn't even take." That's the kind of guy he was. Cade had just seen him before Christmas break. Now he would never see him again. As investigators pieced together what had happened, Captain Joe Lear of the Lancaster County Sheriff's Office confirmed what many feared. Icy roads had caused the crash. Alcohol wasn't a factor. It wasn't reckless driving. It was winter's quiet menace, and one missing click of a seatbelt. And that's when the deeper irony struck. Just 4 months before his death, Derek had written a column for the Daily Nebraskan. The headline, "Individual Rights Buckle Under Seatbelt Laws." In that piece, Derek argued passionately that seatbelt laws were an overreach of government power. "It is my choice what type of safety precautions I take," he wrote. Those words now echoed with haunting weight. The very argument he made, the belief he stood behind, had become the cause of his own death. His refusal to wear a seatbelt wasn't about rebellion or carelessness. It was a decision, one rooted in principle. But principles can't stop physics. Ice doesn't care about ideology, and the windshield doesn't negotiate freedom. Derek's death hit the university like a thunderclap. A brilliant light, extinguished in a moment. A student who should have been in class the next week, sitting in the front row, raising his hand. A future lawyer, a friend, a son. What makes this story more painful is what it could have been. A scare, a lesson, a bruised memory. But it wasn't. It became a headline, a eulogy, a cautionary tale. And it begs the question, how often do we cling to freedom without weighing the cost? In the United Kingdom, when seatbelt laws were introduced in 1983, fatal front seat injuries dropped 29% in 1 year. In 2017, seatbelts saved nearly 15,000 lives in the United States. The data is undeniable, yet still some resist. Still some believe they'll be fine, that it's their choice, that nothing will happen to them. Derek believed that, and now he's gone. His death isn't just a tragedy, it's a mirror, a moment to pause and ask, what choices are we making every day without realizing how much hangs in the balance?
Did you know that a daredevil met his end in the most unexpected way? Bobby Leech, who survived plunging over Niagara Falls in a steel barrel in 1911, didn't meet his end in some wild stunt. In 1926, he slipped on an orange peel while walking down the street.
It was July 25th, 1911 in Niagara Falls, Ontario. All eyes were on one man, a 54-year-old former Barnum and Bailey circus performer named Bobby Leech. For years, Bobby had talked a big game. He claimed he could outdo Annie Edson Taylor, the schoolteacher who had become the first person to survive a plunge over Niagara Falls in a barrel a decade earlier. Despite Taylor's famous warning, nobody ought to ever do that again, Bobby was convinced. He would not only survive the falls, he would do it better, tougher, and louder. He was a natural daredevil. Years before, he'd parachuted into the Niagara River after leaping off the Upper Steel Arch Bridge. He owned a restaurant on Bridge Street in Niagara Falls, where he'd often regale his customers with stories and his big plan to conquer Horseshoe Falls in a barrel of his own design. After countless delays, growing expenses, and mounting anticipation, the moment had come. His vessel was no ordinary wooden barrel. It was cylindrical, made of steel, and outfitted with wooden bumpers at both ends. The crowd's energy was electric as word spread that Bobby was already in the water. At about 3 p.m., a speeding car pulled up at Table Rock. The driver jumped out, breathless, and shouted, "Bobby's on his way!" The crowd leaned forward. Thousands watched as the barrel raced down the Niagara River, bobbing and spinning in the churning current. As it neared the brink of the mighty Horseshoe Falls, it struck a rock. The impact was brutal. One of the front bumpers was torn away, and inside Bobby was slammed hard, his forehead gashed open. Still, the barrel held. Then, at exactly 3:13 p.m., it happened. The crowd fell silent. The only sound was the thunderous roar of the falls. The barrel dropped. The world seemed to stop as the cylinder vanished into the foaming abyss. Seconds passed like hours. Then, cheers, a shout from the crowd. "There he is!" Dozens more followed. The barrel had reappeared, battered but intact, bobbing in the whirlpool below. But was Bobby alive? For 20 agonizing minutes, the barrel swirled in an eddy, refusing to come to shore. Finally, Fred Bender, an employee of the Ontario Power Company, tied a rope around his waist and dove into the icy water. With strength and courage, he reached the barrel and secured it. Helpers pulled them both to safety. The crowd surged forward. Harry Williams, owner of the Lafayette Hotel, pounded on the side of the barrel. Silence. Then, 3 faint knocks from inside. Bobby was alive. When they pried the barrel open, Bobby was bloodied and broken. He had a gash on his head, both kneecaps shattered, and his jaw was fractured. Still, dazed and groaning, he asked for 2 things, some oxygen and a cigar. 6 months in the hospital followed. He would never fully recover, but his fame exploded. When he returned to Niagara Falls in 1920, he opened a pool hall and resumed his daredevil lifestyle. He toured the world with his wife, bringing his battered barrel along. He told his story in crowded theaters and small town halls, his name whispered in awe, Bobby Leech, the man who faced the falls and lived. But the man who beat Niagara could not outrun fate. In 1926, while on a publicity tour in Auckland, New Zealand, Bobby stepped on a discarded orange peel. He slipped, fell hard, and broke his leg. It seemed minor, just another bump for a man who had faced death and won. But this time, it was different. Antibiotics had not yet been discovered. The wound became infected. Gangrene set in. Doctors tried everything. They amputated the leg in a desperate bid to save him. But Bobby's body was too weak. He died during surgery on April 28, 1926. He was 69 years old. He was laid to rest in Auckland's Hillsborough Cemetery. His gravestone reads, "In loving memory of Bobby Leech, world famous for his trip over Niagara Falls in a barrel. Died 28th of April, 1926, aged 69 years. R.I.P. The man who roared into history in a steel barrel and left it quietly on a peel of fruit." It was July 29th, 2011, in the quiet town of Durham-Sud, Quebec. 38-year-old Chantel Lavigne, a mother of 2, lay motionless beneath layers of cellophane and mud covered in blankets, her breathing shallow, her skin burning hot. She had come seeking transformation. What she found was death. Chantal wasn't reckless. She wasn't naive. She was searching for meaning, craving clarity, peace. some connection beyond the chaos of daily life. Since 2007, she had thrown herself into the world of New Age spirituality, exploring healing workshops, energy rituals, and alternative therapies. After the birth of her second child in 2009, her hunger for spiritual growth intensified. She wanted more than just comfort. She wanted transcendence. That summer, she believed she was on the cusp of a breakthrough. The seminar she signed up for was called Dying in Consciousness, led by a self-proclaimed spiritual guide named Gabrielle Frechette. She claimed to channel an ancient mythical being named Melchizedek. To her devoted followers, this wasn't absurd, it was divine truth. Chantal had been warned. Her family had watched her drift further from them, deeper into this belief system. She canceled a family camping trip to attend the seminar. It wasn't just a weekend retreat to her. It was a test, a transformation. She believed it was necessary for her soul. Gabrielle Frechette, along with assistants Jeanette Duclos and Gerald Fontaine, promised purification, cleansing of the body and spirit. What they delivered was torment. 9 people, including Chantal, entered the farmhouse that day. The ritual was brutal. Each participant was smeared with mud, wrapped tightly in plastic wrap, covered in thick blankets. Cardboard boxes were placed over their heads to trap the heat and restrict air. They were told to hyperventilate, to push through, sweat it out, cleanse themselves. It was hot, stifling. The room had no ventilation. This was not a traditional sweat lodge. There was no cultural foundation, no safety precautions, no trained oversight. It was a grotesque imitation, twisted into something dangerous. The hours dragged on, 9 of them. One person collapsed and had to leave. Another experienced distress so severe they nearly passed out. Still, Chantal pressed on. Maybe she believed pain was part of the journey. Maybe she thought the breaking point was where real change began. But her body had reached its limit. Her temperature soared past 40.5 degrees Celsius, over 104.9 degrees Fahrenheit. She stopped responding. Her body, dehydrated and overheating, began shutting down. Finally, far too late, Frechette, who had no medical training, called emergency services. By the time paramedics arrived, Chantal was unresponsive. She was rushed to the hospital. Doctors tried to revive her. They couldn't. She died from hyperthermia and multi-organ failure. The autopsy compared her internal condition to being cooked alive. The news stunned Quebec and rippled across Canada. How could something like this happen? How could a woman who wanted healing die in such horror? Authorities quickly launched an investigation. The farmhouse was examined, the organizers questioned. What emerged was chilling. No medical screenings had been done. No safety precautions were in place. Airflow had been deliberately restricted. The so-called ritual was reckless and unscientific. 3 years later, justice arrived. Though for Chantal's family, it was too late. In December 2014, Gabrielle Frechette, Jeanette Duclos, and Gerald Fontaine were convicted of criminal negligence causing death. Frechette was sentenced to 3 years in prison. The others received 2 years each. During the trial, Quebec Court Judge Alain Fabi stressed how irresponsible, even callous, the ritual had been. In a hot, humid environment, restricting airflow was not just uncomfortable, it was deadly. And the leaders had done nothing to assess whether the participants were even healthy enough to endure it. They had chosen belief over safety, blind faith over responsibility. Experts were horrified. Diane Cote, a criminologist at the University of Montreal, called for greater oversight of fringe spiritual groups. She warned that without proper regulation, these movements, often cloaked in promises of enlightenment, could become fatal traps for vulnerable people. Chantel Lavigne was one of them. But she wasn't foolish. She was seeking truth. She believed in something better. She wanted healing, a deeper connection to the universe, to be more than just a mother, a partner, a woman carrying debt and exhaustion. She wanted to rise above all of that. Instead, she died in agony, alone beneath plastic and mud.